He was born in chains, beaten, branded, trained to die for others' amusement. But he didn't stay silent. He rose, and the world shook. Before there were kings or presidents leading freedom marches, before revolutions were planned in palaces, there was a man, a slave, who had no army, no weapons, and no name known to the world. But he had something far more dangerous. A mind that refused to break, and a fire that refused to go out. This is the story of Spartacus. And it's not just about ancient Rome. It's about you and the chains you don't even know you're carrying. Welcome to Still Rise, the place where quiet stories speak the loudest. Here we don't shout to get your attention. We whisper so your soul can listen. In this series, we explore the life of Spartacus, not just as a warrior, but as a man, a slave who found power, a human who stood when the world expected him to kneel. This is part one of his story, a beginning born in silence and destined to rise. Spartacus wasn't supposed to matter. He wasn't born in a palace. He was born somewhere in Thrace, a rugged, wild land, far from Rome. He was nobody. A farmer's child, maybe, raised with mud on his feet and storms in his bones. But Rome saw something else, not a child, a weapon. When the Romans came, they didn't offer peace. They offered chains. He was captured, dragged away from his homeland, and sold like cattle. He was forced into the ludus, the brutal gladiator training camps where men were broken like horses, their names stripped, their identities erased, their futures decided by the tip of a sword in an arena where thousands screamed for blood. But here's where Spartacus was different. While others cried at night, he watched. While others begged for mercy, he studied. Not just the sword, but the system. He realized something most never see. The arena wasn't just about death, it was about control. Rome used fear to rule. And Spartacus, he started to learn how fear works, how crowds cheer for slaughter, how emperors distract with bread and blood. He learned that the system didn't need truth, it needed obedience, and he had no intention of obeying forever. Each day Spartacus trained harder, but not just to win, to understand, to wait, to plan. He made no speeches. He didn't stand tall, not yet. But deep inside, something was shifting. A belief was forming, not in gods, not in destiny, but in the simple radical idea, I am more than what they say I am. And sometimes that single thought is enough to change history. As days turned into months, Spartacus began building something invisible. Trust among other slaves, among fighters, among the forgotten. He became a quiet leader, not with words, but with how he stood, how he listened, how he never gave up even when the whips tore skin from his back. The guards noticed, and they grew nervous. But Spartacus never gave them a reason to punish him. He smiled when needed. He bled when demanded. But inside he was building a rebellion, one not born of anger, but of clarity. And when the moment came, a moment carved in blood and fire, he would be ready. He wasn't just surviving, he was waiting. In silence, he was becoming the storm. The Roman Empire thought it had broken him. They took everything. His name, his freedom, his future. But Spartacus had something they couldn't chain his mind. In the Gladiator school of Capua, surrounded by killers, thieves, and the broken Spartacus became something no one expected. A leader, not with titles, not with speeches, but with silence, with clarity, with conviction. While others fought to survive, he studied them, watched the guards, counted the routines, memorized the weaknesses of the Roman system. Because Spartacus wasn't planning for the next match, he was planning an escape. The silence spark one night, when the guards grew careless and the chains were loosely fastened, the moment came. Spartacus led a rebellion of 70 gladiators armed with nothing but kitchen knives and stolen swords. They didn't just run, they struck back, killed the guards, escaped the compound, and disappeared into the hills. To Rome, they were fugitives. To the slaves watching from the shadows, they were fire. The spark became a flame. Within days, hundreds joined Spartacus, runaway slaves, rebels, even some Roman peasants tired of oppression. He didn't promise glory, he didn't promise riches. He promised something more dangerous. Hope. Hope that the whip could be broken. Hope that even Rome could be made to bleed. With no formal training, Spartacus began organizing his people not as a mob, but as an army. They trained in forests, hunted like wolves, moved like shadows. They weren't soldiers, but they were free men now, and that made them fight harder than any Roman legion. Rome reacts. The Senate laughed at first. Just slaves, they said. Just another riot. But when Spartacus's army began defeating actual Roman detachments and looted supply chains and liberated towns, the laughter stopped. Rome sent legions, but Spartacus didn't just fight back. He outsmarted them. He studied terrain, used ambush tactics, attacked where they were weakest, and vanished before retaliation. In 2 years, he'd defeated multiple Roman commanders. A man with no rank, no state, no backing, just conviction, and a fire that refused to die. Throughout the empire, whispers spread like wind. Have you heard of him? The slave who defeated Rome. Spartacus, he's real. To the slaves, he was a savior. To the poor, he was justice. To Rome, he was a threat unlike anything they'd seen. Because Spartacus didn't want to rule Rome. He wanted to free people from it. And that made him dangerous in a way no emperor ever was. But freedom is never given. It must be earned. And the empire doesn't surrender its strikes. Spartacus had done the impossible. From a handful of starving slaves, he'd built an army. From rusted tools and stolen blades, he'd forged weapons of war. And from the bloodied sands of the Gladiator ring, he had risen as a name whispered with fear across the Roman Republic. But victory came with a price. As more and more slaves broke free and joined him, so did the weight of leadership. Now it wasn't just survival. Now it was revolution. Winter of 72 BC, Rome expected the rebellion to die in the cold. But Spartacus did the unthinkable again. He led 70,000 men across the snow-covered Alps, training them not just to fight, but to believe. To believe that their lives could mean more than chains. They were not tools, not property, not beasts for spectacle, but men, human beings, worthy of freedom. And something happened. The rebellion was no longer just about Spartacus. It was a movement, a fire spreading through the heart of Rome. But fires attract storms. Rome could no longer ignore him. The Senate sent its finest generals. Legions, not squads. Soldiers trained in decades of conquest. But what they didn't understand was this. Spartacus and his army weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting because they had nothing left to lose and everything left to gain. That kind of army doesn't follow orders. It follows purpose. And so, in ambush after ambush, Spartacus outsmarted the Roman elite. Using guerrilla tactics, mountain passes, and Roman arrogance against them. It wasn't just war. It was a message. You may own the world, Rome, but you will never own the soul of a man who has seen the truth. In the villages and towns, words spread like wildfire. Mothers whispered his name. Fathers taught their sons what he stood for. Even Roman citizens began to ask, are we the good ones in this story? That's when Rome knew Spartacus was no longer just a rebel. He was a symbol, a mirror, a reminder that the empire was built on broken backs. And one of those backs had now straightened and stood tall. But here's the truth. History doesn't always say out loud. The Roman Republic was not just scared of Spartacus's army. They were scared of what he represented, because Spartacus didn't just break chains. He shattered the illusion. He proved that power doesn't live in palaces. It lives in people who refuse to bow. Now Rome changed its tactics. No more underestimating. No more second-rate generals. The Senate called on Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most ruthless men in Rome, a man who believed discipline was more powerful than fear, and who would stop at nothing to crush the rebellion. Crassus brought with him not just soldiers, but terror. He reintroduced ancient punishments, forced Roman troops to kill their own for cowardice, and vowed to make an example of Spartacus. Spartacus, too, had changed. He knew that the dream was growing heavy, that hope had a cost. He had led thousands to freedom, but could he keep them free? Every night he stared at the stars and wondered, if I fall, will they remember me as a leader or just another slave who dared to rise? But there was no turning back. The fire had spread too far. The chains had already begun to break, and somewhere deep inside Spartacus knew, even if I die, the world will never forget that for one moment a slave made an empire kneel. The shadow over Rome, he no longer fought for survival. He now fought for freedom. Spartacus, the slave with no name, was now the master of a force that terrified the greatest empire in history. Tens of thousands marched behind him. Not soldiers, not trained warriors, but slaves, farmers, runaways, women, children. But they were bound by something stronger than any legion's discipline: hope. Rome had laughed at him once. Now they watched with trembling hands as one city after another fell under his shadow. The winter of 72 BCE was colder than expected, but Spartacus did not slow down, turned his forces south, toward the very soul of Roman power, knowing full well what it meant. His dream? To cross the sea, to escape Italy, to lead his people beyond the grasp of the Republic. But fate had other plans. The Senate could no longer deny it. This was no ordinary revolt. This was war. He summoned Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a man who had bought power with coin and blood. He was tasked with crushing a symbol. Crassus was ruthless, strategic. He believed Spartacus was not just dangerous, he was contagious. If one slave could rise, all could. So Crassus did what Roman generals do best. He brought discipline, he brought fear, and he brought death. But Spartacus was no fool. He struck first. Ambushes, traps, mountain retreats. He turned Roman tactics on Rome itself. His army may not have worn uniforms, but they moved like shadows and struck like storms. Wealthy landowners fled their villas, and rumors began to spread in Rome's marble halls. What if he comes for the city? What if he reaches the gates of Rome itself? What if he wins? But Spartacus never wanted to burn Rome. He wanted out. To return his people to the lands they were stolen from. To end the nightmare, not become it. Yet every path was blocked. The ships he paid for betrayed him. The sea turned against him. Rome's legions now formed a wall, north and south. Crassus, Pompey, Lucullus. They were no longer protecting a city. They were defending an empire. And Spartacus stood in the middle, 60,000 souls behind him, and no way out. But he would not beg, would not kneel, he would not trade chains for favors. Turned to his people and said, "We die or we live free, but we will not crawl." He led one final charge, not to win, but to make Rome remember. It wasn't a battle. It was a message carved into the ground with blood. Spartacus fought not at the back, not from safety, but at the very front, with a broken sword and eyes filled with defiance. No one ever found his body. Some say it was crushed among the thousands. Some say he vanished. Others believe he lives in every man who refuses to kneel. Spartacus died a slave, but not a broken one. He died without a country, but with something far more powerful, a legacy. Rome crucified 6,000 of his men along the Appian Way. Their bodies hung as a warning, but they forgot something. Ideas cannot be crucified. Spartacus was not the first to rise, and he would not be the last. Spartacus knew it wouldn't last. Every step his army took southward away from the gates of Rome was a decision weighed not just in strategy, but in sacrifice. Some begged to press on, to strike Rome while it was shaken. Others whispered of ships, of leaving Italy altogether. Escape was possible, freedom a distant shore away. But Spartacus, he had changed. This wasn't just a fight to run away from. It was a fight to end slavery or die trying. He made a fateful choice. Instead of fleeing, he turned around, marched north again toward Rome, and this time Rome was ready. They sent Crassus, a man richer than kings, ruthless as wolves, a man who believed in power, not mercy. Crassus knew Spartacus wasn't just a rebel. He was an idea, and ideas were dangerous. So Crassus set a trap. He dug ditches, built walls, not around Rome, but around Spartacus. A prison made not of chains, but of desperation. Spartacus and his thousands were trapped on a cold, barren ridge, no food, no water, no escape, and still he did not surrender. One night, under heavy rain, Spartacus made his move. Using ropes made from vines, his men climbed down the steep cliffs. Quiet as ghosts, they snuck behind Roman lines. Few hundred broke through, then more, then more. It was not a retreat. It was preparation for one final battle. Spring came, and with it, the bloodiest day of Spartacus' rebellion. Tens of thousands clashed in the fields of Lucania. It was chaos, screams, steel smoke, and Spartacus, surrounded, wounded, kept fighting. They say he fought his way toward Crassus himself, that he wanted to cut off the head of the empire's fury. He almost made it, but there were too many. A spear, a sword, a storm of Roman soldiers. Spartacus fell, but he did not fall alone. Rome counted their dead. Over 60,000 slaves had fought alongside Spartacus. Many were captured, and Rome made an example of them. 6,000 crucified, lined up along the Appian Way, miles and miles of crosses. Never rise again, but messages fade, and legends remain. Spartacus never got a statue in Rome. He wasn't buried in a tomb of marble. No coins bore his name. No scrolls told his story from the Roman point of view, but centuries later his fire still burns. In revolutionaries, in dreamers, in those who refused to accept the chains they were born into. He was a slave, and he became the greatest general Rome could never forget. The echoes of freedom. Spartacus was gone. The man defeated. The army scattered. The rebellion crushed beneath the might of Rome. But something remained. An ember, a whisper, a memory. Not just of a slave who fought, but of what could happen when the forgotten stood up. For centuries, Rome tried to erase him. No monuments, no poems, no celebrations. They left his body to rot, unclaimed. But legends are hard to bury, especially the ones born in blood and carried in silence. Centuries later, thousands of miles away, on an island bathed in sunlight and soaked in suffering, another rebellion would begin. Haiti, where sugar plantations were stained with sweat, pain, and chains. Where black slaves toiled under French rule. And where, in 1791? A man named Toussaint Louverture remembered the stories. He knew Spartacus's name. He knew what it meant to rise, to fight, to burn your name into history, even if it cost you everything. Toussaint didn't just rebel, he won. Haiti became the first nation born from a successful slave revolt. Rome was long gone, but Spartacus, he was very much alive in spirit. It didn't stop there. In 19th century America, where millions were enslaved, a man named Frederick Seward Douglass stood before crowds and said the lessons of Spartacus are not just of rebellion, but of man's right to be free. And another man, John Brown, tried to start a rebellion of his own. With fire, with weapons, with conviction, he too remembered Spartacus. Even in Hollywood, 2,000 years later, they told his story again. But this time, in a different world, a world fighting new forms of slavery, oppression, injustice, censorship. In 1960, at the height of the Cold War, the film Spartacus became a symbol. Not just of a man with a sword, but of a world asking, what do we do when freedom is denied? And in a scene now etched in cinema forever, when the Romans tried to find Spartacus, one man stood and said, "I'm Spartacus." Then another and another, till 100 voices claimed his name. "I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus." Because Spartacus wasn't one man anymore. He was all of them. Yes. He was all of us. In every struggle for dignity, from Nelson Mandela's prison cell in South Africa, to protesters marching in silence across Selma, to every person who refused to be owned, Spartacus marched with them. Not in body, but in spirit. The idea he died for never did. And that is the true power of rebellion, not the sword, not the blood, not even the victory, but the memory, the echo, the refusal to be forgotten. Spartacus taught us something the Romans never meant to share, that no empire is greater than the will of the oppressed. That dignity cannot be buried. That even a slave, nameless, penniless, beaten, can become eternal. Why Spartacus still matters today. He lived over 2,000 years ago. He left no writings, no palace, no crown, only a story carved in defiance. So why does Spartacus still matter? Because in every age, in every system that oppresses, his ghost rises again. Spartacus was not just a rebel, he was a mirror, held up to every empire that forgets. Power is not eternal. Chains, rust. People remember. In today's world, with cameras on every corner, with systems built not of swords, but algorithms and economics, the chains are harder to see. But they are still there. In sweatshops, in prisons, in fields where hands grow food but never taste freedom. Spartacus matters because oppression still breathes. Reminds us a system that thrives on silence fears a single voice, and a whisper can become a roar. In countries where people cannot speak freely, in workplaces where exploitation is hidden behind clean walls, in schools and borders, in courtrooms, the question still echoes: will you kneel or will you rise? Spartacus chose to rise. Not because he thought he would win, not because he had hope, but because to not rise was a death worse than the sword. He matters because most people don't fight. Most people accept, and that's what systems rely on. But when one person says no, others begin to wonder. He was born in a forgotten place, raised to be broken, whipped, used, discarded. But he refused to be invisible, and today millions remember him, because Spartacus is more than a man. He's an idea. That no life is too small to rise. That even if you lose, there's dignity in standing. That rebellion is not always about winning. Sometimes, it's about reminding the world that you existed. In modern protests, you see him. In faces standing before tanks. In voices crying behind bars. In workers demanding dignity. They may not know his name, but they carry his fire. What would Spartacus say to us today? Maybe nothing. He was, after all, a man of few words. But if he stood before you, scarred, bruised, unbowed, he would look you in the eye and ask, will you live free or die waiting? When Spartacus was finally defeated, Rome didn't just kill the man. They tried to kill his memory. It crucified 6,000 of his men along the Appian Way. Not just as punishment, but as a message, a warning. This is what happens when you resist Rome. But here's what they didn't expect: the story lived, not in monuments, not in scrolls, but in whispers, in the minds of slaves, the hearts of rebels. You won't find long records of Spartacus in Roman texts. No detailed accounts, no speeches preserved. Why? Because they didn't want to remember a slave who scared the Republic. Rome wrote its history around emperors, senators, and Caesars. But not the Thracian gladiator who brought the Republic to its knees. Because Spartacus didn't fit the narrative. He wasn't noble, wasn't Roman. He wasn't supposed to matter, but cracks form even in marble. Centuries later, historians started asking, why did the greatest empire panic over a group of slaves? Why did it take so long to defeat him? Why does his story still burn through time? And when they looked deeper, they found the uncomfortable truth: Spartacus wasn't just fighting Rome, he was exposing it. He exposed the cruelty of the arena, the hypocrisy of a republic built on slavery, the illusion of Roman order. What Rome wanted to forget, the world began to remember. Artists, philosophers, revolutionaries, all saw in Spartacus a symbol that refused to die. In Haiti during the slave revolt of 1791, his name was whispered. In France, during the Revolution, his legacy was painted on flags. In America, during the Civil Rights Movement, he stood silently beside them. And today, in the quiet corners of YouTube, books, classrooms, films, he returns, not as a conqueror, not as a martyr, but as a mirror. A reminder that power lies not in titles, but in courage. So what did history forget? Not Spartacus himself, but why he fought. He wasn't trying to build an empire. He wasn't trying to wear a crown. He wanted one thing that no human be owned. And in a world still wrestling with freedom, his simple wish remains unfinished. Spartacus died. But the questions he asked, the fire he lit, still burn. And long after Rome fell into dust, the name of a forgotten slave still walks through time. What makes a man rise when the world expects him to crawl? What builds a mind that doesn't crack even under chains? This isn't just a story about Spartacus the fighter. It's about Spartacus the mind, the rebel, the strategist. It's the man who Rome couldn't figure out. They had seen slaves revolt before, out of anger. It's out of fear, out of desperation. But Spartacus was different. He didn't just fight for freedom, he fought with clarity. Clarity is dangerous. It means a man knows exactly what he wants. And even worse, he knows exactly what he's willing to sacrifice to get it. Let's understand his mind. Where did this strength come from? Was he born with it, or was it forged? Thrace, the first lessons: he wasn't born in Rome. He was born in Thrace, a wild, mountainous land. Their boys didn't grow up soft. You learned to fight. You learned to survive. And most of all, you learned silence. Pain was normal. Fear was familiar. Hiding your emotions wasn't weakness. It was armor. So when Rome captured him, when they chained him, when they beat him and sold him as a gladiator, Spartacus didn't scream. He listened. He observed. and he waited. The gladiator schooled discipline of the mind. In Capua, Spartacus entered a place worse than prison, the ludus gladiatorius. Here, men were trained to kill and be killed. But Spartacus treated it like a mental laboratory. Every fight wasn't just survival, it was study. He learned the Roman style, how they moved, how they trained, how they thought. He learned patience, focus, precision. The world thinks gladiators were brutes, but Spartacus became a tactician inside that pit. The Romans gave him tools, but they didn't realize they were also sharpening a mind. Strategic silence, here's what made Spartacus terrifying. He didn't talk much. He didn't roar like a general, he whispered. He planned, and when he acted, he struck with speed and efficiency. He knew that most people give themselves away. Their fear, their ego, their weaknesses, he didn't. He remained unreadable, even his closest fighters said. We never knew what he was thinking, but we always trusted where he was going. Control under chaos, Rome expected slave revolts to be emotional, messy. But Spartacus organized tens of thousands into units. He trained them, disciplined them, led, not just inspired. He made order out of the broken. He didn't allow looting. He didn't allow chaos. He didn't allow revenge. Why? Because he wasn't building a gang. He was building a vision, a force that deserved freedom, not begged for it. The power of refusal. He could have run. He could have escaped into the mountains, vanished. But he refused, stayed in Italy, marched toward Rome. Why? Because Spartacus didn't want just to live. He wanted the idea of slavery to die. That kind of decision doesn't come from anger. It comes from deep clarity. A clarity that breaks chains before hands ever do. In the end, Spartacus wasn't just fighting Rome's armies. He was fighting Rome's psychology. He shattered the idea that a slave is weak. He broke the belief that power is inherited, proved that leadership isn't given. It's built in silence, pain, and patience. The legacy they couldn't kill, they thought it would end with a sword. That if they killed him, the rebellion would die. That the idea of freedom could bleed.
But what Spartacus started wasn't just a war, it was a question.
A dangerous, unforgettable question whispered across centuries. What if the powerless stop obeying?
The Romans hunted every trace of him.
They crucified his men along roads, burned scrolls, silenced stories. But stories, real stories, don't die like that. It's not when they touch something deeper. Guess Spartacus didn't fight to rule. He didn't want a throne. He fought to stop the crushing of souls. It's to make sure no man, no woman, no child was born and buried in chains. And that terrified empires. For centuries, his name vanished from textbooks. His rebellion labeled a slave revolt. But it was bigger than that. It was a human revolt. Revolt against systems that say, you were born to kneel. And here's the strange thing. Though the Romans killed him, Spartacus never really died. His name resurfaced in revolutions, whispered by prisoners, workers, rebels. Toussaint Louverture, Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, Che Guevara. Each one in their own time carried that same fire, that same defiance, and behind them quietly stood Spartacus. Statues, no monuments, no empire. Just a legacy built on the most dangerous belief a human can hold. I was not born to be owned. That's why they feared him. Not because of the sword in his hand, but because of the flame in his soul. The kind that doesn't need an army to start a war. Just a moment, a refusal. A whisper that becomes a roar no more. Maybe that's what makes Spartacus more powerful than any emperor Rome ever crowned. Because in the end, he didn't just fight for freedom, he became it. The end that refused to die. The valley was quiet now. No shouting soldiers, no clashing blades. Only the wind brushing through blood-stained soil. Spartacus, the man without a nation, without a title, was gone. Rome claimed victory. They hung the bodies of his men along the Appian Way. Over 6,000 crucified, a message carved into wood and flesh. But what Rome never understood was that Spartacus never needed to win a war to become eternal. He had already won something greater. It made people remember. They had tried to erase him. No statue, no coin, not a single surviving word from the man himself. But history whispered his name anyway. From dusty roads to candlelit revolutions, from forgotten tombs to whispered dreams of freedom, Spartacus lived. The final lesson what Spartacus left behind, he didn't change the world through politics, didn't leave behind a golden crown. He left something far more dangerous, an idea that no chain is unbreakable, that no power is absolute, that no man is born beneath another. And maybe, just maybe, that idea reached you, not because you're a soldier, not because you fight wars, but because deep inside you, like Spartacus, there's something unspoken, a quiet fire. Maybe your chains aren't iron. Maybe they're doubt, fear, silence, obedience. But they are chains nonetheless. When Spartacus, without ever speaking to you, left a message: rise. What we learn from Spartacus, that history remembers courage, not comfort, is that when you stand, even if you fall, you rise forever in memory. That the most powerful revolutions begin not in armies, but in minds. That silence is not peace, and obedience is not freedom. So ask yourself one last time, will you live quietly in chains? Or will you die remembered standing? He was not born a hero, did not die a king. But Spartacus became something far greater. He became the question every empire fears, the answer every soul longs to live. I am not property. I am not afraid. If this story whispered something to you, if a part of you stirred while listening, then don't let it fade. Subscribe to this channel, not for noise, but for meaning. For the quiet stories that history tried to bury. For the voices that still echo in silence. And if you believe courage still matters, share this story with someone who needs to remember that even the forgotten can rise.